language. I chose English. And I'm going to start. We at the Seattle Special Education, PTSA, acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish nations, whose people still steward this land today. This land we occupy embodies a living history shared by diverse Coast Salish peoples, many of whom are still fighting for federal recognition. There are many ways to understand Indigenous relationships to land and heritage. One tool is the map, which may change depending on the map's author and narrative. We encourage you to take an action by learning about the land back movement.
Sherilyn, your sound is a little bit jumpy. I don't know if there's anything you can do about that, but.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. I am Sherilyn Crowther, president of the Seattle Special Education, PTSA, and pleased to welcome today our panelists, Dr. Cassie Martin, Jen Chong Jewell, Joy Sebe, Jennifer Carls, and Sarah Butcher. Because we want most of this time to be about the conversation, I'm going to turn it over. There will be a question and answer at the end of the panelist sessions. We will ask you to speak slowly for our interpreters. Use the raise hand feature. And if you have questions you want to send anonymously, you can send those to Mel Spiker. Mel Spiker is one of our Coast secretaries. So if you find Mel, M-E-L, you can send her the question directly. We will be monitoring a chat. We will be capturing all of the questions and sharing them with the panelists at the end of the event or after the event. And then we will be gathering answers together that if we've missed some, to be able to share on our website. That said, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Sarah to get us started.
Thank you so much, Sherilyn. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is everyone seeing the slide, or are you seeing notes as well?
We're seeing your presentation mode. So we're seeing just the slide.
Perfect, thank you. I just wanted to make sure nothing changed since I practiced it earlier. Well, thank you again, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of meeting tips before we get in much further. I know we're all probably fairly familiar with Zoom at this time, but if you are having challenges with your signal, you can close all the other programs that you might have open to maximize your bandwidth. If you continue to experience a lag, you can try to exit and re-enter the meeting. We're keeping an eye on the waiting room, so we will make sure you get back in. You can use the chat feature to add kind of comments or thoughts and participate as we move through our time together this evening. You can also put questions in the chat, and you can also raise your hand, as Sherilyn was mentioning. As we get to the question and answer portion, we will remind you again that it's time if you want to raise your hand to ask a question. If you are continuing to have technical assistance issues, you can chat us, give us a message, and we'll try to help you out. So I introduced myself. I'm co-founder and director of Roots of Inclusion. Roots of Inclusion is part of the Family Engagement Collaborative, which I will introduce you to other members of the Family Engagement Collaborative here in a little bit. And we are part of the Inclusionary Practices Project. And I am here with Dr. Cassie Martin. Cassie, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Cassie Martin. I am the Executive Director of Special Education at OSPI, going on just shy of 3 months, so new to the position. And I had the opportunity to be partners with the Family Engagement Collaborative in our inclusionary practices work prior to this, and continue my partnership with them ongoing now. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm also the parent of 2 children who attend the Seattle Public Schools.
This is Cheryl Lynn. One reminder to practice slowing down for our interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you. We'd love to take a moment to get to know you all that are here joining us tonight as well. So if you would like to, you can utilize the chat and you can share your name. You can share if you're a parent or if you have a different role within the school system and where you're joining us today. So we want to begin with a poem called Belonging. We are alone together, the way blades of grass are alone, but exist as a field. Sometimes I feel it, the green fuse that ignites us, the wild thrum that unites us, an inner hum that reminds us of our shared humanity. Just as 35 trillion red blood cells join in one body to become one blood, just as 136,000 notes make up one symphony. Alone as we are, our small voices weave into the one big conversation. Our actions are essential to the one infinite story of what it is to be alive. When we feel alone, we belong to the grand communion of those who sometimes feel alone. We are the dust that hopes, a rising of dust, a thrill of dust, the dust that dances in the night with all other dust, the dust that makes the world. I'd like to thank Jen Chongjul with PAVE, who was able, who shared that with us. And so I'd love for you all, again, let's utilize the chat. And as you think about belonging, to share a word or a short phrase that describes what belonging means to you, or if you just have an initial reaction to the poem. And I'm going to ask if anybody on the team here has access to chat. I'm to go ahead and chime in while I try to work out how to see it on my screen. I lost it somewhere.
Click on the dots.
I can do that, Sarah. I see meaningful interaction with those around you, included, to be heard, to feel seen. Everyone is valued for how they show up, a valued contributor in ways that make sense for the individual, being connected to others.
I'm going to chime in, Kathy. We're losing you a little bit.
All one, to be included and heard, to feel safe.
Kathy, your audio is cutting in and out, and it looks like you might be frozen. I will jump in while Cassie works on Wi-Fi, the joys of Zoom, right? It's great. We can all be together and have access.
Oh, no, I'm not speaking.
Technology doesn't cooperate. So thank you all. There are some really wonderful reflections about what belonging means. A lot about relationships, being valued, friendships. Absolutely. Thank you all for that. So as we move through our discussion today, think about and reflect on
Emma, ya por favor, hijita, ya.
How do I see my child and my family represented in our school? Consider, does my child feel seen, heard, and needed in their school? And do I feel a sense of belonging in our community? So now I'm going to pass it over to Cassie Martin to lead us through these next slides.
Thank you, Sarah. Can everyone, is my audio coming through okay?
It seems to be better now, Cassie.
Okay, thanks. I apologize. I'm at a hotel in Spokane, so I don't have my typical internet with me. So, you know, to start with a deep dive into why inclusion matters, we first have to look at and acknowledge what's happened in the past, acknowledge what's happening now, and envision what might be in the future and our roles in all of this. So what is the history and basis for attitudes around exclusionary practices? What about attitudes around inclusionary practices? What are the current state of our schools? And how can we learn from what works to shift and change attitudes, systems, and beliefs to make sure our public schools are places where all students belong? When we're talking about inclusive education, we're talking about everyone. And this includes students with disabilities and students whose identities exist at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression. For example, within schools, there exist dominant ideologies regarding race and disability that justify dysfunctional education ecologies that target and push out students of color. And we can't ignore that in the field of special education exists exclusionary and deficit-oriented beliefs and practices that are pervasive and have particularly harmful consequences for multiply marginalized students. So a primary example of this would be the prominence of and the commitment to segregated special education placements and the disproportional assignment of Black, Brown, and Indigenous students to these placements. When we talk about the history of exclusion, we have to acknowledge that although we've made progress, and that's been demonstrated through federal laws and shifts and changes in policies and practices, there continue to be settings where students are excluded. And this occurs in different landscapes across our country, across our state, within districts, and even, you know, with neighboring schools. So acknowledging the past and assessing our current situation, and this includes identifying the strengths that exist within our public school systems, allows us to move forward with new and better systems, structures, and outcomes for our students. And you'll hear me talk about this a lot tonight, which is taking a strength-based approach, because there are strengths that exist within our school system and or in our individual, a separate initiative. What can we learn about what's worked well in support of our students, all of our students, and include in those conversations our students with disabilities? And Sarah's gonna talk more about belonging in a little bit, and I'll include that as I'm speaking as well. But consider, what is the relationship between inclusion and belonging? What does it mean to be included in a school, a community, a classroom? And what are those additional elements that lead to feeling like you really belong? Are you known? Are you needed? Do people miss you when you're absent? Are you present in environments across the school? And are you getting the supports you need in those spaces? Sarah, we can move on to the next slide. So first and foremost, inclusive education, where each and every, and I was just talking to some of my colleagues, and they're here with us today, about shifting some of our language from all to each and every, to make sure that we're really making sure that we're taking care of each and every student in our schools. So where each and every student belongs, this requires a cultural shift in philosophy and practice throughout a school community. And although we're talking about students with disabilities, I want to discourage us from thinking about this as a special education initiative. Rather, it's a school-wide commitment. If we simply change the way we deliver special education services without considering the culture of a school or how all students and teachers and families engage in teaching and learning, we're never going to make the changes we need to truly impact student learning, engagement, and belonging. I want to remind everyone that when our students are isolated, our families are also isolated, and our educators are isolated too, working for all students. Or instead, we could choose to transform our system to create new and better ways of doing things for students, families, and educators. Another principle that can help us shift to more inclusive education is, can people hear me? Okay.
You're cutting in and out. If you want maybe to try
Turn my
turning it
camera
down.
off, is that okay? Okay,
If that helps. Yeah.
there we go. Is this a little bit better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, we could either fix the system or think about transforming the system to make it better. So another principle that could help us to shift to more inclusive education is that firm belief that in every school or district, there are things that are working well. And we call this kind of taking an appreciative lens. In education, we tend to examine the problems associated with our practices. And you've heard me speak about some of the inequitable systems that need acknowledging and addressing. But at the same time, we're under-examining what's working well, why it's working well, and how we can use that information to make things better. And this asset-based approach allows schools, districts, and communities to leverage their strengths and work together to become more inclusive and reimagine what education could look like. And the education literature is showing some really good evidence that this is an effective approach. Sharing the stories of the impacts of inclusion, community, and belonging is another great way to disseminate information and leverage change. Visiting schools that are inclusive or who are on their journey to becoming a more inclusive school, or sharing student and family stories are powerful ways to communicate why inclusion and belonging matter. This includes not only sharing instructional strategies or systems or structures and team planning tools, but why schools committed to this journey in the first place and how they engage diverse partners across the system in the process to facilitate lasting and sustainable change, and the barriers that they encountered along the way. Inclusive education is not a destination, it's a journey. Our schools shift and change as the needs of our students change, as we learn about the best ways to educate and include students. And as new students, families, join school communities, and as students and the adults in our communities learn, our practices need to reflect that learning in responsive and meaningful ways. And this is why we're fortunate to have educators that view themselves as lifelong learners and that put in the work to interrogate their beliefs, practices, and systems, and recognize that what was in place 10 years ago to support students might not be the best strategies and systems to use today, and that we have a lot to learn from students and families through their lived experiences, knowledge, and expertise about their children and how they learn. And this is especially salient given the recent remote instruction. Families know more than ever about how their students interact with curriculum and specific modes of instruction and in the community context of schooling. So, finally here, the research also lets us know innovative leadership at all levels of our system is a critical factor to lasting and sustainable change. And this requires clear communication that messages a commitment to each and every student, and ways to create equitable systems and structures through engaging in distributive leadership with principals, teacher leaders, families and students, and the state, and getting back to that idea that we all have a role in making sure that students belong. And these are some questions to ask as you think about your children and their experiences in school. What's working with your child or children in school to help them engage in learning and feel part of a community of belonging? Or what are your hopes and dreams that would allow for or create that kind of culture for your child in Seattle schools? And you'll notice in that statement that I didn't kind of parse out learning from belonging, because these are not competing priorities, but rather companion priorities. So centering the why in this work, there are many stories and experiences and events that shape why inclusion matters to each and every one of us. It might be our own personal stories, experiences, relationships, maybe professional ones. I saw we had some educators on the line here. We might be responding to what the 80 years of research tells us about the benefits of inclusive schools for all students. What speaks to us most might be our beliefs and commitments to equity, racial and disability justice, or our commitments to creating a sense of belonging and self-determination for our children that they can carry with them beyond their years in school, and how inclusion impacts post-secondary outcomes. It possibly could be a combination of one or more of these, or additional ones that I haven't mentioned. And, when we consider the why, we still, as I mentioned earlier, have to acknowledge the ways our educational system has contributed to the marginalization of specific students. And this means that there are barriers that do exist in schools, whether they're institutional or interpersonal or systemic, that continue to reinforce exclusion and students' experiences of oppression. So this is why dismantling these barriers requires commitment, inquiry, and collaboration, meaning that all of us are working together to pursue educational justice through inclusive school change. This is one reason that trust and communication are so important, and some repair that we need to do between students, families, educators in our schools. We need to ask ourselves how we create a culture of belonging, care, and trust for students and families who have been historically or are currently experiencing marginalization in our school system. So if you want to take a minute and share in the chat, why does inclusive education matter to you? If it's important to you, why is it important for your child to attend an inclusive school? Or are there concerns or worries you have about inclusive education? And I'll go ahead and I'll put those prompts in the chat. I see comments about mental health and sense of belonging. My child feels like they don't belong, they don't want to go to school. Removing the shame from different. That our children won't live in a self-contained world as an adult. How to interact with the bigger world. And keep entering those in the chat and we'll revisit those. Thank you for those comments. We can move to the next slide. So the literature on culture circles and journey mapping highlights how storytelling and problem solving through dialogue can support all people involved in education, students, families, teachers, and administrators, to consider and enact personal and collective action as they make connections between their experiences, the experiences and perspective of others, and systems of power and oppression. An equitable world requires that we have the knowledge and wisdom of lived experience the most impacted individuals and communities need to be central to decisions about solutions and priorities. Student and family voice must be integral to the discussions we're having about systems that perpetuate ableism in our schools, so we aren't asking permission from families, but are co-designing with students and families for a more just system. Sarah, we can move on to the next slide. And thank you for the comments in the chat. I'm looking those over. So a few more slides before I pass it over to Sarah, but let's take a minute and consider and interrogate our own beliefs. Who are the students that are pulled away from our general classrooms? What are the systems, structures, beliefs, and attitudes that are reinforcing this separation and segregation? Who isn't included? Why? And is where we're sending them better? And do we have evidence that what they're getting is better somewhere else? You know, and maybe right now the answer is yes, if the supports and services students need aren't provided in an inclusive setting. But we need to ask these questions. When students are removed from general education, do we even know where they're going? What services they're getting? And again, what evidence do we have that it's better? And do we have evidence that it might be worse or harmful? In their book, Street Data, authors Shane Saphir and Jamila Dugan call us to action to create more equitable schools and remind us that this transformation requires us to acknowledge that our systems, practices, and narratives have been designed to perpetuate disparities in outcomes for marginalized students. And that requires us to deliberately identify barriers that predict success or failure, and we need to actively disrupt them. And this requires deep, equitable, and culturally sustaining learning to take what our students are teaching us about what they need to thrive socially, academically, and emotionally in our schools. Sarah, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So on this slide are three figures from the book Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity by Floyd Cobb and John Crownapple. The figures illustrate an adaptation of Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs and highlight the reality of a belonging gap. So you can see in figure 1, basic needs are met first. Before students can achieve, they need to have a sense of belonging. Additionally, belonging is nurtured through equitable access to social and academic opportunities. So in figure 3.2 shows the cost of achieving to belong. Achieving in order to belong undermines a person's value as a human being. Therefore, how can students be expected to achieve when systemic barriers limit their achievement opportunities and fail to nurture a sense of belonging? And then finally, in figure 3.3, it shows that when we expect students to achieve before they belong, we see a widening belonging gap, which is insurmountable and hinders achievement and self-actualization for students. So again, this is why we need to practice learning and belonging as companion priorities instead of competing priorities. What are the supports needed for students to learn in inclusive settings, especially when we know that when students belong, they do better in school? It's inequitable to ask for students to enter a classroom where the systems and structures aren't created with them in mind. And this, we need to address how students with disabilities are positioned in our structured narrative of schooling. And it begs the question, which I know that the answer to, but we need to think about what this looks like in practice with students with disabilities, which is, what story do we want to live in? What story do we want to tell? One of segregation and othering, or one of belonging? I feel confident that all of us would say belonging, but this is where my dear friend, Principal Kathy Davis, we can't make any neutral decisions. All the decisions we make must ensure that each student experiences a robust, inclusive, belonging-centered education. And then here on the slide, if education is the key to liberation, then we must visualize and operationalize what that could be. What does the schooling experience look like where students are seen as fully capable to chase their dreams? So what do you think your child would say, or what do you think about when considering your child's school? Can you answer yes to these questions? This school was created with me in mind. I see myself represented in my school, and I have a sense of belonging. And I'm with those questions and hand it over to Sarah. I apologize for any technical difficulties, and hopefully they'll resolve themselves.
Thank you, Cassie. So let's think a little bit more about inclusion and build on what Cassie was just sharing with us. So as parents, when we have a child, there's an expected pathway, and it generally looks like the top line there you see on the screen. Now, as parents, we recognize, right? Parents and families, they recognize that not all children are going to go to college, and not all children may decide to have a family, but parents generally are content with some variation of that top line. However, if a child has a disability, almost from the moment the disability is diagnosed, special programs and interventions are introduced. While well-meaning, they also create a track, or they can create a track that continues to separate a child from their peers, the community, and from opportunities. So the work of inclusion really is to remove barriers and ensure equitable and accessible spaces and opportunities for every child and every family, so all succeed and belong. And inclusive practices are crucial for that, in particular for youth with disabilities and their families. But the reality is they benefit every child, every family, and our community as a whole. Now, if you've been involved in conversations around inclusion, or work has been happening in your school or district around inclusion, often you might hear, yeah, okay, inclusion for some, but what about, right, ... and you can fill in the story there. I want to share this quote. For every student who remains educationally segregated, there are other students with similar attributes, abilities, and needs who are successfully included. This simple fact suggests that whether a student with a disability is meaningfully included may have less to do with his or her characteristics and more to do with the attitudes, skills, structure, and practices of the adults responsible for providing education. So inclusive schools benefit every learner. I'm going to touch on a few elements and then kind of go a little bit deeper into some examples, in particular as we think about the reality of what challenges Washington is experiencing with schools, and obviously within Seattle and surrounding districts. So differentiated instruction increases student engagement and learning. So let's think about that for a minute. So differentiated instruction recognizes that not all learners are at the same place. And in special education, there's a particular skill set that educators have, right, on how to catch kids up, strengthen foundational learning skills, and make sure kids are on track and meeting standards. Those skills, especially for students that may be struggling with a reading concept or a math concept, is important not only for that student who's receiving that specially designed instruction, but it benefits all learners in the classroom, and the knowledge and expertise that can be shared from the special educator to the general educator. Academic supports are going to help students access the full curriculum. And if those supports are isolated to just students with disabilities, or we don't implement universal design in classrooms, Obviously, we're not allowing the benefit of those supports to be accessed by other students who may need them. We know that not all students with a disability are in special education or need special education. And we know that there can be times in our lives where maybe we didn't sleep well and we're having a rough day. And so having access to information in different ways would be really beneficial. Or we're stressed out or worried about something or not feeling well, right? You can think of any number of examples that students may be experiencing. So having a universally designed classroom that generalizes academic supports, normalizes that we all at times need support is incredibly valuable. Social, emotional, and behavioral supports help maintain a positive, safe, and supportive learning environment for everyone. I think this is essential when we consider the challenges and what youth are experiencing right now around anxiety and other mental health issues. By having a classroom that is designed to be inclusive and incorporates social, emotional, and behavioral supports and centers relational safety and ensures that the adults have the support and understanding of how to provide relational safety and support a student socially, emotionally, and behaviorally is a good thing for all learners and can have a great impact rather than waiting for students to escalate to a point of crisis. Then again, sending them places or accessing additional, outside supports, which of course at times may be needed for a student to access additional support. But when we are incorporating these elements into the classroom, into an inclusive classroom, we are providing a stronger foundation for those students and rather than exacerbating an issue. Respect for diversity creates a welcoming environment for all. I think we can easily see and recognize that we want our young people to recognize and value the great diversity within our communities. And it is to great detriment that we exclude students with disabilities as much as we do, and that we exclude, frankly, any student through some of our policies and practices that are implemented within schools. And lastly, inclusive practices make effective use of a school resources. The reality is the funding around special education has been an ongoing conversation, and there continue to be challenges with that. But when students or when schools are implementing inclusive practices and really understand how to leverage the resourcing that is available, it makes an effective use of those resources. And of course, it benefits every learner and allows a stretch of those resources, in particular when it comes to some of the social, emotional, and behavioral support pieces. I'm not going to dive too much further into school funding because that could be its own conversation. So let's think about, if we were to consider inclusion as a mission, right? And as Cassie was mentioning, everyone has an important role, and we cannot say that enough. Shifting a system to be equitable, accessible, and inclusive doesn't happen in isolation. We have to set ourselves up for success. And so we have to make sure that we are communicating and that we are we are transparent, that we are working together. And again, communicate. It's key. In addition, we need to examine our policies, our practices, our structures, the relationships that exist or those that don't exist. All of them have to facilitate inclusion. So if we just say, okay, we're doing inclusive practices, but we don't examine pieces that are already in place in the system, what we end up finding is that you don't see the system change in the way that was hoped, or there are challenges that can be encountered because there wasn't consideration for the system and the way it was designed. And engaging and partnering with families, and we're going to dig a bit more into that, but it is essential. Cassie also mentioned that inclusion is a journey, and we all have to be on that journey together. We have to make sure we have a shared definition of success for where we want that journey to end up, and communicating and engaging and partnering is key. So we all play a part and we have shared ownership in the success of all children in our community. We need to build strong connections between all families, our schools, and our community. So I just want to reinforce that inclusion is a journey for everyone. And we need to not only be engaging families who have children with disabilities, but we need to be engaging all families, because the reality is inclusive education, inclusive classrooms, inclusive schools give us the foundation that we all want for our students to reach their full potential. So family engagement has a number of benefits, but I just want to touch on how specifically it benefits schools. So research shows that family engagement improves teacher satisfaction, school climate, and school performance. It supports positive academic, social, and emotional outcomes for students, which makes sense, right? Because families and educators are partnering in the work of a student being educated. And it transforms the educational system and the community. You know, again, thinking back to what Cassie was sharing with us about the importance of storytelling, right? And the cultural assets and strengths that families bring with them. If we're engaging our families, we really have the opportunity to not only evolve and change a system, but truly transform it to align with the values we all hold. So what does family engagement do for families? It connects families with community resources and social networks. It increases transparency and it builds trust. And I think we can all appreciate how essential trust is in those connections and relationships. And it supports relationships needed between families and educators so that students are successful. Families know their students best. And often if we can work together to come up with shared plans or strategies on how to address issues, it's a win-win. And what family engagement does for the community, it strengthens our communities. It forges stronger connections between families, schools, organizations, and community members. It builds awareness for equity, inclusion, and belonging in all spaces, right? If we aren't talking to each other, we may not see that there's a barrier that some of our community members are experiencing that others don't, simply because they don't see that as they move through the system. It also creates more engaged community members. The reality is this work is overwhelming, and it can feel overwhelming and isolating for educators, for professionals, for families. And so the more we can connect and build a shared understanding, and again, that shared commitment and definition of success, what success looks like in this work, it'll be hard work, but together we are stronger. So we're going to now move into a panel discussion and also start taking questions, because really, I know I've been kind of keeping an eye on the chat now that I can see it, and I know there are a number of questions. So first, I'd like to introduce our other panel members, and I think they should be perfect, spotlighted. So Joy Sebe is the Assistant Director at Open Doors for Multicultural Families. Jen Chong Jewell is joining us, and she's the Director of Parent Training and Information at PACE. You met Dr. Cassie Martin already. And of course, I've been talking for too long, and I'm Sarah. I'd love to start with Joy. Joy, just as you're introducing yourself, can you speak a bit to what Open Doors does, in particular in Seattle Public Schools, and maybe touch on just some challenges and strategies that you're seeing in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. My name is Joy Sebe. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here with Open Doors for Multicultural Families. But first off, I started this journey where I started to work for Open Doors and really fight for systems change in our schools as a parent, a Seattle parent. I have two sons, and I really fought hard, and my family experienced a significant amount of struggle and emotional, I would say, trauma navigating the special education system, navigating the school system on behalf of both of my children. So I just want to thank all of you for putting together this event, because I know as the teacher strike continued on, you know, the families who are served by Open Doors were really a primary part of the conversation. So Open Doors for Multicultural Families serves people with disabilities across a lifespan. But I'll just focus on families who are served through Seattle Public Schools, and then school age families who, you know, may be more relevant to the education system here. So Open Doors serves families who we consider intersectional, who have intersectional identities. So that includes families who have loved ones with disabilities, who are people of color, families of color, immigrants and refugees, and then their children or loved ones, many family members and caregivers have disabilities themselves. So I'll just kind of share a little bit about what we do at Open Doors, and as I go along, I see many of our staff members here who are really the ones doing the on the ground work. So I will just shout you out, and if you can wave, that would be great. So first off, in terms of Seattle Public Schools, what we do is to connect families to special education services and to help them understand what their rights are. For example, that a family has the right to an interpreter who understands the family's language and can communicate and help the family serve as an equal member of the IEP team. So just for example, we have family support specialists. We have Tekle, Mr. Tekle Hiabu here. Mr. Tekle, can you wave? Mr. Tekle supports Amharic and Tigrinya speaking families. Ismahan Bihi over here, Ismahan supports Somali speaking families, also in Seattle Public Schools. Ismahan, can you wave? Oh, thank you. Ismahan gave a little heart. We also have programming. So Meow Meow, get ready. We also have programming for students with disabilities and their family members, students with and without disabilities. And so, for example, Meow Meow runs a friendship circle that just met last Saturday, actually, and there was a drum circle, lots of integration of arts and music. Meow Meow, can you wave? Thank you. And then lastly, we also really advocate for systems and policy change. And so we've really been fighting hard, and we're able to pass through legislation to ensure that families have access to interpreters and translations. So that's language access. Emily Fung, can you wave? Emily is our advocacy and civic engagement program lead, and she has also run our first self-advocacy leadership training program for self-advocates of color. And along the way, we've had tremendous support from Danielle Eidenberg and Adrian Stewart in terms of all of that work. So anyway, just wanted to not just represent me, but let you see the faces who are actually doing the work behind the scenes. And I'll hand it back to you, Sarah. Thanks for giving me that time.
Thank you, Joy. And now I'd like to introduce Jen Chongjul. Jen works at PAVE. She's the director of Director of Parent Training and Information at PAVE. And Jen, I'm wondering, when you introduce yourself, if you, Jen also is a parent, so if you just want to share a little bit about how your hope in your vision for belonging for your own child, and how that connects to what you want to see in Washington State and the work you do here in Washington.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also not sharing video right now because I've been feeling under the weather and I don't look my best. So I'm not sharing video. But if you are able to see video and you might see my profile picture, there's an image of me with my son, Gabriel. He is 12 years old. And in his image, he's smiling at the camera. And he is a very handsome young boy. I just have to say, as his mom, I believe that. When I think about inclusive education, it actually brings me back to the poem that was shared at the very beginning. And there's so many reasons why that poem resonates with me. I think about, in our humanity, there are those times when we do feel alone. And I think that's a feeling that we can all connect to and have a deeper understanding of what that feels like. When I think of inclusive education, there's the line in the poem that goes, just as 136,000 notes make up one symphony, I think about the symphony of a lot of love and joy that lives in my home with my son, because he is in my family. He is fully included. He is there, and we have so many precious moments. And then sadly, when I hand him over to school, it's a different experience. And it saddens me because I feel like there have been so many limited opportunities for others to experience him as the full human being that he is, and all that he brings and all that he can contribute to a community of learners. So I think that's connected to, the stories of so many other students. Some of those reflected in our chat comments today. Like my heart went out to those stories because it's again back to that, my child doesn't belong, is not included. And it shows in so many different ways. It might not just be about disability, it might be for other reasons. And then also, with our families too, do families feel like they belong at school? So I feel like when we move towards that symphony, if we can vision that together, then we can truly appreciate why every single note of the 136,000 notes are needed to make that happen. And currently we don't have that in our public schools. I don't have that at my local school, and I don't see that as a standard practice or belief about public education in our state. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for being here, even though you're not feeling well. Really appreciate it. So before I pass it over to Sherilyn, because there are so many questions, I'm looking through the chat. I've been looking at questions, and there's one I'd love for us to start with, just because it's a really common issue and question that we hear. So there's a question about social and emotional supports, and how are they in place for some children whose actions pose safety concerns for other children. So really thinking about, behaviors, right? And how behaviors show up in the classroom. I will just start with a couple of pieces of information, and then I'm going to invite the other panelists to join in. So it is an ongoing conversation, right? So Washington has been doing a substantial amount of work around social emotional learning, around looking at discipline and how to reduce disproportionate discipline, in particular since COVID, looking at the mental health of our young people and how do we provide behavioral supports, not only for our young people, but also make sure that our adults are getting the supports they need as we navigate this stressful time. And then also Washington has a work group that's actually working right now, looking at issues around restraint and isolation. I am involved in that work group, as is, I think, at least one other person that's here this evening. What I will just say is that we have to recognize in Washington State that we have not done a good job of building infrastructure to support with technical assistance and coaching, especially around really substantial issues that we're trying to lay across the whole system. And so, you know, how we address behavior is one of them, right? And so as the conversations around restraint and isolation are continuing, and the goal is to, one, we need to eliminate practices like that are harmful to young people and also the adults in the system. But we need to, more importantly, never get a situation escalated to that point unless it is a true emergency. And we do that by making sure that we have layers of support in the system. So a piece of that is social emotional learning and how we are teaching and modeling skills across the system, not only with young people, but the adults. And then also, how are we really creating relational safety? That takes a strong understanding of how to be trauma responsive, how as adults, how we respond can calm a situation or inadvertently escalate it, right? And then what do we do instead of these more punitive discipline practices when we are dealing with a challenging behavior in a classroom or in a school? So this is an example of an issue that it is, again, part of the journey that we are going to go on. Obviously, safety is paramount, but the reality is when you look at the data, and we can have future conversations about this, when you look at the data of what is happening, our classrooms, when there is a situation where a student is escalating and other students around may see the response to that, it is not healthy for anybody. And, you know, pointing back to Cassie's earlier slide around the different reasons a child may be excluded, what we're seeing is that behavior is a big piece of that. But again, often when you have a system that only pays attention to crisis points, you inadvertently escalate children and drive families and children to that point because that's where they access services. So we need to get upriver of this issue, and that's a significant amount of work that's happening. But there is a number of elements that are needed to build that infrastructure, and then of course making sure that districts are able to prioritize that work, and that work is resourced. And again, that work has to be done in collaboration and transparently with families. I will let anybody else jump in that would like to.
Are you also taking questions or comments from the audience or from panel?
This is Cheryl Lynn, and I'll just say that just as I put in the chat, we will be taking some questions. If everyone would use the raised hands, that would be the better way to do it. And remember to just speak slowly. And I actually forgot one other feature for our ASL interpreters. If you would announce your name when you before you speak. So this is Cheryl Lynn. Okay, Ed, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for that. You know, I thank you for, first of all, thank you for having this conversation. I really appreciate that. You know, I do have a child in the system, but one of the things that what I recognize is that this year at my particular school, there is a focus on inclusion, and I appreciate that. But I'm not sure if I understand the execution strategy. I happen to also be on the BLT for that school. And you know, the feedback we're getting from teachers is that they don't know where they're supposed to get their support from. And so we've tried to implement inclusion without understanding the structure where the support comes from. I'm not certain that our teachers are properly trained. And so I'm concerned in that while I fully support the direction and the idea of inclusion, I also think that when executed improperly, it may do more harm than good. So maybe the question is, where do we go? Where does the building go for support, for knowledge? Because I think my school is in desperate need of that.
This is Sherilyn. I'll just add on that as I'm looking in the questions. Somebody did ask, are there changes happening in the education programs and teaching degrees? I feel like this all sounds nice and great, but the teachers that are being produced from colleges and universities being trained to educate children with disabilities. So related to Ed's question, the big picture too.
Cassie, do you want to start?
So thank you. If my audio goes out, please let me know. This is Cassie. Ed, I appreciate everything that you just said. And I think you're right. You know, the research and the outcomes that Sarah was talking about earlier, and that I spoke to around inclusive education, isn't just about what they need. It's also much more about how we're structuring the way that we're engaging in teaching and learning across our general education system. So as I spoke earlier, it's not just about, you know, taking special education services and putting them in a general education context. It's thinking about how this teaching learning system structures interact with one another to build an inclusive culture. So, you know, I hear you about the more harm than good. There are opportunities for technical assistance. And I think that Sarah spoke to this a little bit about how we need to better connect our technical assistance efforts across social emotional learning, across, you know, some of what we're doing around MTSS, if you've heard, multi-tiered systems of support, around inclusionary practices. So we're all working together to build a more equitable system for everyone. So it's not just about changing the way that we're providing those services to students who qualify for special education. It's also about how we're engaging in teaching and learning within those general education contexts. So it's both. And going back to our prep programs, we recognize some of the disconnects. So there's varying situations where pre-service teachers could be in a preparation program that is talking about inclusive education and teaching some principles of inclusive education. But first, that could happen in a silo of special education and not include general educators. Second, they can be placed in a teaching placement for what they've learned about those inclusive practices. So there's just these disconnects across our system. And that's why when we've been talking today, we're talking about how do we help these systems interact so there's greater collaboration, greater consistency, shared outcomes. So I don't think we're there yet. We're talking about, you know, ideas. Definition of inclusion is different than another. And I think someone put that in the chat. If students are just being placed in, like, if I have a student with a disability that's placed in a general education classroom without the support they need to be successful, in addition to not having the classroom have the structures and supports it needs to accommodate a wide range of learners, inclusion. So there's so many different layers, but it does necessitate these kind of intersections of systems working together to provide more inclusive education. So it's across systems up and down those systems. So from our universities to our school, our states, to our technical assistance providers, to our families, and to our students. Again, thinking about how we're transforming and changing the way we're engaging in teaching, that setting is all that matters, is all that matters. There's a lot of different variables that need to interact with one another in order to create systems where everyone belongs. Sorry if I was
thank you.
losing audio there.
This is Sherilyn.
Yeah,
It
thanks,
is a little
Kathy.
difficult. Sarah, did you want to
Sorry,
add more?
Sherilyn. I was going to say, Kathy, as much as we love to see you, we can see your photo, and I would go ahead and leave camera off just because what you have to say is so incredibly valuable. I just want to reinforce a couple of points just very briefly around what Cassie was mentioning around, you know, the different systems and the pieces that need to move. Like, yeah, this is really complicated, right? What's the saying? We're building the plane while we're flying it. The reality is that Washington has been one of the worst states in the country for including students. That doesn't happen by accident, right? That happens because the rules, the structures, the relationships, the policies, the practices have all been designed to exclude. And so we are working to change all of that. And so a big part of the work is looking to those teacher preparation programs, principal preparation programs, the technical assistance around this issue, as well as other issues that are fundamental to upholding the civil rights young people have and equity, access, and inclusion. So things like the inclusionary practices, MTSS, elements around social and emotional supports, culturally responsive practices, all of those pieces should be non-negotiable. And in my opinion, then the state has an obligation to make sure that they're building and resourcing the infrastructure to provide the training, the coaching, the mentoring, the support for districts to move through that system change and hold them accountable for moving through that system change. Yes, it's a journey, but it's not an optional one, right? There are laws and protections that are afforded to students with disabilities and many other student populations in our schools. And in my mind, when the state isn't doing its job in terms of getting organized and coordinated and responsive in the work, then the burden falls to our building leaders and our classroom leaders, our educators, to have to carry the weight of this. And if you don't feel supported, that's not a good feeling, right? And so while there is this, I see a lot of comments in chat and questions around this disconnect, this lack of communication with families and communities. The angst in our system is only exacerbating that. And the reality is we're going to have to start to trust each other to move forward. A big step towards building trust is transparency. We don't always have to hear what we like, but what we hear needs to align with the actions that we see so that we have that trust and confidence in those that we are in this journey with. So with that, Sherilyn, I'll let you ask some additional questions.
Okay, thank you. This is Sherilyn. Thank you, Sarah. And I'm assuming you just need to put your hand down. Mel is going to ask a couple of the anonymous questions that we've received. I will just also say, I feel what you're saying, Sarah, in terms of asking for trust. Trust is earned, and I know you are not the one, and I know we are not the one. It's very challenging when it's your child. And I think I'm speaking from a lot of what I'm seeing in the chat. So Mel, go ahead.
I agree with that 100%, Sherilyn. I feel that very much. Hi, everybody. I'm going to read a couple questions here. I'll just read them one at a time in the order that I've received them. We hear the studies that show that inclusion benefits all students. But what does that look like in practice when students are having a hard time? For example, what does it look like to practice inclusion for students who are dysregulated and perhaps disrupted? Does anybody want
Joy or Kathy, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the understanding that all behaviors are communication. And so we often talk about disruptive behaviors or challenging behaviors and all of that. But there needs to be an understanding at all levels of the school, right? Back to that multi-tiered system of student supports. Tier 1, the understanding that all of those behaviors are communication, and what is it that the child or the student is trying to communicate, and to get to that, to get to the root of it, and to help the student express and communicate, because that principle applies whether you're in the school or whether you're in a friendship or in a family environment, right? That principle of understanding that all behavior is communication and practicing that and engaging in relationships with other people, I think helps us all become better communicators and really like better people, better leaders. But I don't know if anyone else has anything to add there.
Yeah, I'll build off what Joy is saying. I think even more than that, this is about a mindset shift. So we still have kind of that belief and that mindset that barriers exist within our students, not within the environment. So we're thinking about that it's those behaviors that are getting in the way of learning. What is happening in the environment that are barriers, the student engaging in their learning, in their environments with relationships? So are there barriers, like Joy saying, to communication? Are there barriers to instruction that's culturally responsive? Is there barriers to curriculum that's representative of that student, where they see themselves in the curriculum? So us looking beyond just what's happening, with our students, to really shifting that mindset, that it's not about asking our students to change, but it's up to us as the adults and as the community to look within our environments and our practices around what needs to change. And that's a real big mindset shift for people to view the barriers as occurring within the environment.
This is Cheryl Lynn. Thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Joy. I see there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of trauma in our chat. Mel, will you share another question?
Yes, on the trajectory of the last question, I'm going to read this other comment that came in anonymously. I would love to hear how we can help families and children without disabilities be part of inclusion. Right now, there is not a lot of open communication about what is happening in classrooms, and a lot of fear and judgment occurs, especially when classmates have challenges that are often labeled as bad or breaking rules. How do we help classmates and families know what is needed to support children with or without IEPs? In addition to that, how do we address behavior management tools still being used that are shaming and create exclusion?
This is Sarah. I can start and then invite others to chime in. Yeah, that's a loaded question. And I'm honestly just reflecting on just so much of what's coming through the chat as well, right? And so, it may sound, I don't know what the right word is, but we keep saying, right, this inclusion is a journey, and it needs to be one for the full community, and which means we have to be in relationship together. And as we can see from the chat and just from some of the comments right here this evening, like, we know relationships are broken, right? Like, trust is broken, and you don't just flip a switch and turn that back on. And even if you have, commitment and agreement around inclusionary practices, as, many in families with young people with disabilities want, their child included want access, that doesn't mean it's going to happen if the whole community isn't aware. Because when you have othered children in a system for so long, othered their families, right? They're not in that circle of human concern. And so there is going to be fear. There is going to be misunderstanding. And again, that's why, this idea of being in relationship together, how do we build relationships when they're absent? How do we repair relationships when they're broken and rebuild them? How do we tend to them, right? This isn't a one-stop shop. This isn't just a simple memo, right? This is an ongoing commitment and effort. And the reality is when you think about what schools are asked to do, when you look at what is prioritized in terms of our state around policy, building connections with relationships with families and engaging families and communities is not. They say it's a priority, but the actions don't align and show it's a priority, which to me breaks my trust, right? That the system cares, which tells me we have to keep pushing, not that the system cares, but just that it isn't prioritized, right, in policy and practice. And we see that and how it plays out in our schools and in our community. So I know I didn't get to kind of some of the nuances around the behavior pieces, but really it all comes to that, so that we have everybody on the same page as we move through this work, whether it's around behavior, whether it's around inclusion, around academic, whatever it is, we need to be on the same page. I will let Cassie or Joy or Jen, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah. Just like you, Sarah, I'm looking at the chat and I'm hearing the pain in people's questions, right? I don't hear your voices, but I guess we're not here to provide like easy answers, right? We're here to kind of start a conversation and be here together and be here for each other. I mean, I guess as from the perspective of a parent, what I have had to do, and this is Joy speaking, what I've had to do at Open Doors, because I transferred from being a parent with pain, navigating the system, to being a person who helps other parents and tries to bring people along and tries to listen to what other people are experiencing. I think again, what Sarah says really resonates, and it's very challenging to do this, but to invest in those relationships and to I think it really starts with giving ourselves time to continuously heal despite all of the trauma and experiences that we're having on an ongoing basis, so that when someone's sharing with us or talking with us, we're able to really listen to what they're saying instead of having that trigger something within us that brings back up all of that pain. That pain can kind of serve as a wall that really makes it difficult for us to listen and to build relationships. And so, and that's hard. That's really hard, because we're constantly moving through every single interaction that's so painful, and seeing the pain that our children are living with every day. So I don't have an easy answer for that, except that what I have found is that if I can be there for others and then listen to what they're having to say and be of support to them, and they can be of support to me, it starts to build a community, so that when I have something to share, whether the person has a child with a disability or not, they're willing to listen and help me out, right? Because I've been there for them. But that's tricky. Yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to share that.
This is Cheryl Lynn. I appreciate the, not the needle that we're trying to thread, but the safe and the safe space and the holding environment that we're working to create. Just want to reflect on the pain. I do also want to just take a few moments just to also say that we do have Dr. Ross Green coming to speak, and kids do well if they can, is what we're calling this event, because that's what he says. Kids do well if they can. And then we're also going to have a community discussion and move to action. So this is in the November 15th and November 17th. And I will also say, for those of you who are in a space where even with your pain, you can join some of this work. We do a lot with this PTSA. And this is all up on our calendar, including our inclusionary practices, which I added the each and every to, as I believe it was Cassie talking. We've got about less than 5 minutes, so I'm going to have Mel read one more question and see if we can get to it.
Hi, everybody. Okay, I do have more than just one question, but we'll run back to those maybe another time. Maybe we can respond to those somehow. Okay, so this is the question. Sorry, I'm a little bit emotional right now. Let's see. I worry about people practicing mainstreaming and calling it inclusion. And that's the question. So I guess there's no question mark at the end of that sentence, but it sounds like somebody wants to discuss how we can avoid mainstreaming.
This is Jen, and I wonder if I could just say a couple things about that. I believe that happens. Most definitely it happens. So it's very important. I'm sorry, my son's playing guitar. If you can hear that. It's very important for us to know clearly as parents, as family leaders, what inclusion is and what it isn't, so we could address it clearly. And back to the family engagement piece, it's a critical part of the conversation, because as a parent, if I don't understand how my son is receiving services in an inclusive setting, then that's a problem too. And the last thing I just want to quickly say is that I think there's also this bigger opportunity to be in solidarity with many, many other families who aren't here tonight or who experience other degrees of segregation, being pushed out of school, because some of the mechanisms are the same. And when we could be in solidarity and see each other, then we're stronger together, in my opinion. Thanks.
Cheryl Lynn, thank you. And yes, for anybody who is in the PTA, I want to, who is a PTA leader, I will encourage you that this Saturday, the Seattle Council PTSA is hosting a disability justice training. And you cannot have ableism without racism. For any of you who that is a new line, I would invite you to explore it. But if we don't end racism, we won't end ableism. I also just am now correcting a couple things. Legislative advocacy meeting is 10/21 at 10:30, so that's Friday at 10:30, not what I had posted. And the inclusionary practices meeting is not every Monday. Two of my errors. I so appreciate everyone who's here. I really am grateful for our panel and grateful for families to come and express their trauma. Sarah or Cassie, do you have any final word before we need to end and let our interpreters go?
Cassie,
This
did you
is-
want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. This is Cassie. I want to thank all of you for this invitation, and just to let everyone know that I'm, looking over and again at the chat, and in being new to this role, constantly thinking about ways that I can actively disrupt a lot of the things that came up today, and think about ways that I can support students, families, educators, and educational leaders, educational system. That comment, mainstreaming doesn't work. I agree. We're not, what we've been doing isn't working. So we need to do something different. And thank you for inviting me into this space, and for getting to have a continued conversation, dialogue with me. I appreciate that so much. And panelists on the line for including me in the conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, this is Sarah Butcher. I'll just echo Cassie's comments of gratitude for being here with all of you, sharing your comments, your stories, your questions. It's been really meaningful. You have been provided a lot of opportunities, right, for how to engage and continue this conversation, both in conversation within different events and meetings, but also with learning, right? And all of us being in spaces together, listening to each other as we discuss these different issues is really important for shared learning, right? Because we all hold different roles in the system, and we're only going to be successful if we all work together differently. So I appreciate each of you. And clearly this is a conversation that needs to be continued. Thank you. Joy, did you want to say anything in closing? No. Thank you,
I just
Sherilyn. I'll
wanted
pass
to-
it back. Oh, we put a survey link in the chat just for some feedback. If you all don't mind taking a moment and just, in our work with the Inclusionary Practices Project, it's just helpful as we do these types of presentations and events to get feedback from you all. So thank you.
And I just wanted to thank Sarah and Cassie and all of you at Seattle Council PTSA and Special Education PTSA for organizing this, because multilingual learners and students with disabilities and students who sit at that intersection were really at the forefront of that conversation. And I just really appreciate your allyship in bringing them back to this conversation. Thank you.
This is Sherilyn. Thank you. I did check with Jen, and she's okay with us closing. We need to release our interpreters. Thank you again, all, and peace. Thank you. Good night.